Many years ago, I began a search for answers. After seeing shadows, capturing hundreds of EVPs, seeing spirits, seeing a UFO, I feel as though that there are more questions than answers. The bunker is a result of years of research into the unknown. I welcome you to join me in my search for answers. Join me in the bunker.
And welcome to episode 8 of The Bunker. My name is Michael, and we're now into December. This is going to be one of the last episodes of the year, so I thank everyone for joining us in The Bunker. We are now reaching out to between 10 and 15 countries now, which is fantastic. I want to thank everybody for coming on board. Just want to do a little housekeeping in the beginning here. I noticed that a vast majority of our listeners are picking us up through Apple Podcasts, which is a great way to do it. That's where I find my podcast as well. So I definitely encourage you to do that. One way you could help us out, though, is actually to give us a rating on there. Give us a 5-star rating, leave a comment, and that would help us out greatly, just to reach more and more people who may need our help, advice, or who may need to reach out to us to share their stories. You can also share the show on social media, on Twitter in particular. My Twitter handle for the show is @InTheBunkerCast. Again, that's @InTheBunkerCast on Twitter. And the direct email for the show is mailtothebunker@gmail.com. Once again, that is mailtothebunker@gmail.com. If you have a story of high strangeness that you would like advice with, that you would like to share with us, we'll keep your information confidential. If that's how you want to handle it, that's perfectly fine. We'll totally honor that. But if that's the case, feel free to send me a message on Twitter @InTheBunkerCast or at my Gmail account, mailtothebunker@gmail.com. And today we're going to be talking about a group of cases that took place in Brazil, taking place roughly in the 1970s, up until, at the latest, what we can tell from the reports that I found, until at least 2008. But it could still be happening. There's no real way to prove or disprove that at this point. Any listeners have any information about that, pro or con, I greatly appreciate that as well. Also, I just wanted to pre-apologize. A lot of these names of these places are in Portuguese, and I do not particularly speak Portuguese, and so I may be butchering some of these names. I just wanted to pre-apologize for that. So just bear with me on the pronunciations. Also, I just wanted to point out before I get started that this episode is in no way a replacement for reading this book. This book really blew me away. This came as a suggestion to read from Justin at normalparanormal.com. It blew my mind, and I have to say, it didn't keep me up at night, but it really gave me a lot to think about when it came to thinking about UFO encounters and abductions in particular. I mean, this is some dark stuff, and it's pretty disturbing. All these cases that we're going to be talking about tonight are basically taken from the book UFO Danger Zone, which is written by Mr. Bob Pratt, Pratt. It's a fantastic book. Mr. Pratt took in total about 10 trips to Brazil and back, interviewing witnessers and abductees. And this book is a result of those 10 trips to Brazil. He interviewed, dozens of folks that were accosted, that were pursued, that were abducted. Many of them attempted to be abducted, but for some reason, and the details we'll get into in a little bit, seemed like the technology was a little experimental, I want to say. It's very strange. But we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. It seemed to me, like reading this book, that there were more negative encounters and attacks on people from UFOs in this area of Brazil than in any other area of the world that I've ever heard of. Again, anyone that has information to the contrary, I welcome it, because I don't recall ever seeing this many reports that have a negative spin on them, that are kind of terrifying, than I have read in this area of Brazil. Like I said, Bob Pratt, he made 10 visits to Brazil, beginning back in May 1978, and his final trip was in July of 1993. He began speaking to the investigators in Brazil, and one of the things that they pointed out, and I think this is a very important detail before we get into it, is that there are many of these villages filled with these encounters and abductions and attempted abductions that are in these remote villages. And we're talking the 1970s. This is pre-internet. I don't really know how much the UFO story was in the consciousness of these folks down there, because we're talking about farmers and fishermen and women that were just working in the fields 12, 14, 16-hour days, fishing at night for their food. Hard people. I mean, these are hardcore people that live off the land, farmed, and I don't really know how much this UFO sort of culture was in their minds before all these things began to take place. But it's pretty clear that once these encounters started happening, that it was in their forefront of their mind from that point moving forward, for sure. So again, I'm gonna this episode is gonna be a tip of the iceberg. I'm just gonna touch on a few cases that sort of encapsulate the overall sort of narrative that ran through these cases. And the first one that jumped out at me that sort of that sounded like a lot of the other cases, that was really consistent with a lot of these other cases, was the case of Moises Campelo. Now, he is out on his land. It is dark. Like the end of the day, it's now dark. He's probably wrapping up his day. Moises sees a light on a distant hilltop, on like an adjoining hilltop, maybe a half mile away or so. And he sees this light moving up and down the hill, and his first thought, honestly, was that it was a car, perhaps driving on another road on this adjacent hilltop. So his first thought was not, it's a UFO, or hey, that's weird, or what. His first thought was something terrestrial, something common. There's a car over there. He just kind of glances at it, makes note of it. But then he begins to see this light make movements that are very, very unusual. It shoots from the ground up into the sky, back to the ground. It's just ping-ponging around. It's moving very rapidly, changing direction very rapidly. And now he's freaked out, because now he knows it's not a car, number one. And two, he's pretty sure it's not any kind of a plane, because of the movements that this thing's making. Now, again, keep in mind, he's seeing just a light at this point. He doesn't know what's the light's coming from. So this is what he sees up until this point. It seemed that once he took notice of the light and its unusual nature, it then seemed to notice him. Because as soon as he noticed that this thing was unusual, that something strange was going on, this thing came over and approached him. Now it's coming close. Now he's freaked out. Now he's starting to get really worried. So now from this light, another light, a beam, shoots down from this light and strikes him. And he notices at this point, as this light's approaching him, to digress just a bit, he doesn't hear any sound. He doesn't hear the sound of a helicopter or a plane. I mean, this is in the 70s, so it wouldn't be a drone, but he doesn't hear any aircraft sounds that you would expect if this were a plane. This thing silently approached him, hits him with a beam. Now, this beam, by this point, he's terrified. The beam hits him. He's immediately paralyzed. And I mentioned he's at the end of his day. It's dark. He had some cookies under his arm that he was bringing home. And once this beam hit him, he became rigid and paralyzed, and so much so to the point that he actually inadvertently crushed all these cookies underneath of his arm. But now he's frozen there and he can't move. He can't scream. He can't talk. He can't call for help. He's helpless and at the mercy of this beam. So he then begins himself. He begins to feel himself being lifted, apparently by this beam. And again, he's unable to call out for help. He's utterly helpless, and he's in this rigid state, and he's being lifted off the ground. Now, he was lifted maybe a meter or two above the ground, not very far, and then the beam turns off as he's like gently laid back down on the ground, and he falls back to the ground. And at this point, once the beam turns off, this light that this beam came from, craft or whatever it is, then slowly just moves over to the top of some trees nearby and just hovers there silently. He notices at this point, now that the beam is no longer on him, the beam, which by the way felt very hot, to the point where he was beginning to feel himself possibly getting burned by this, which is a common theme through a lot of these cases. But he also notices that when the beam shuts off, the paralysis dissipates, mostly. So now he's in a crouch position, and he realizes, oh, I'm free. So he begins to crawl back towards his home, which is, a little ways down the road. Well, apparently this light craft, whatever it is, notices he's trying to get away, and he notices this craft begins to approach him again now. So there's a nearby tree. He crawls underneath of the tree to try and hide, escape, just get away from this thing and prevent it from taking him, because he's now terrified. The beam hits him again. This time he feels the beam, but it feels cold. And now he's frozen in his crouched position that he was crawling in, and he's unable to move, or cry, or scream. And the beam now begins to lift him again. But now keep in mind, he's underneath of this tree. So now he's being dragged up through the tree branches, and he's banging like a pinball through the trees, smacking the tree branches with his face and his arms and legs and just bouncing around as he's pulled up through the tree branches, getting scratched and scraped and cut. Now, he's not sure what happened here, but what it seems like to me is that he must have at some point become lodged in between some branches in that tree, and this craft was unable to keep drawing him up. So he becomes stuck, but he's still being held there by this beam, which now feels cold. So now the craft begins to circle around the tree in an apparent attempt to kind of break him loose of the hold that, where whatever point he's lodged in this tree. So this light circles him. He said he would felt like 15 minutes, although he's not really sure how long it was. This light or craft, whatever it was, seemed unable to break him free of this tree, and so just switched off the beam, and he was dropped, not gently as was last time, but just dropped, hard. Full gravity has now been, reestablished on this poor guy. And now he goes tumbling down through the branches of this tree, smacking all the branches, and more cuts as he goes down, falls down, and lands on the ground. And then the craft then begins actually leaving the area slowly. And he said that as he saw the craft leaving, he heard, at this point, finally, it was making some kind of a sound, and it was a low humming sound that he described as a quiet turbine engine. And that reminds me of another case, and if any of the listeners have listened to episode 1 of The Bunker and the Stonehenge Incidents, as reported by George Obarski, you'll see something familiar there. That low humming sound, as described as a refrigerator, a low turbine engine, a fan motor. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but we'll get into some consistencies with with the Stonehenge incidents in a little bit. So the beam drops him. He, tumbles down to the ground. He's now all busted up and cut up and terrified. But he's free now, and this craft light is leaving the area. So at this point, the paralysis is mostly dissipated, and he then begins crawling for home. He notices, and he crawled because he discovered at this point that not only was his left eye, well, both of his eyes actually burning from looking at this light. His left eye in particular seemed to get the brunt of it, or perhaps it could be also injuries from getting smacked into these branches. His eye is swollen and it's very, very painful, but he's also too dizzy to actually walk. So he's crawling, and it was maybe a mile or so back to his house. So he crawls back home, and he makes it back home. Now, what's important to note here is that this event was far from over for Moises, far from over. That particular encounter was done, and he seemed to be safer now. But one thing that really struck me is the after effects, and there are several, and they're quite alarming. Moises actually found that his left side was numb. His whole entire left side was numb for 3 to 4 months after this event took place. 3 to 4 months, he had no feeling in his left side. His left hip area felt like the paralysis had not completely left that area, although his arms and legs, regained movement. But his left hip felt like it was still kind of paralyzed. His left eye, like I mentioned just a second ago, was swollen so much and it was so painful that he was unable to close it, and it was very, very difficult for him to sleep because it was so painful. He was also, in that left eye, he was blind, completely blind in his left eye for a few days, but eventually the sight returned. His family brought him to a local hospital where he was checked out. They were kind of baffled as to what was going on, how this happened, but they suggested some surgery to help get him back on his feet and fix his eye and so forth. But the odd thing is that they scheduled the surgery. He returned to the hospital to get his surgery, and they have a power outage, so they can't do the surgery. So they return home. A second time, they reschedule. He comes back a second time to get the surgery done. Boom, there's a power outage again. So they return home. Now, if this happened twice, you'd say, wow, it's pretty crazy. A third time, he goes back to the hospital, complete power outage. So now he says, you know what, let's go home. He throws his hands up and he just refused to get the surgery done, just kind of puts it out of his mind and just moves on from there. So he never got the surgery, long story short. The scars weren't just physical for Moises. He also, emotionally, was terrified to ever go outside by himself alone after this event. And that's a more impactful statement when you consider that this land that he worked and farmed and lived on his entire life was the land that his mother owned, his family owned this land. He spent his entire life living and playing and working on this land, and now here he is. He's too terrified to go outside by himself as a grown man after dark for fear of this craft returning and coming to get him. Now, Mr. Bob Pratt spoke to approximately 1,700 UFO witnesses from 78 to the 90s, and many of them had experiences very, very similar to Moises. I picked this one out because it had all the elements of many of these other cases, and it's really disturbing when you stop and think that that these crafts possessed some kind of technology that seems very advanced. But certainly if you read this book, you'll see in case after case, it seems like these folks either were struggling to use this technology or they were just developing it, and this is just this is like an R&D project for this technology in this area for whatever reason. Because you'll read in these cases, as with like Moises stuck in this tree, he became lodged in this tree. They obviously wanted to bring him up into the craft because that's what they were doing. They made 2 attempts at this. But in either case, the first case they gave up and just set him back down on the ground, and in the second case he became stuck in this tree. Now, I think it's safe to assume that they wanted to take him, and that's what they were doing. Seems pretty clear. Why is the question, and who is a bigger question. And we'll get into some of those details later, which are, to me, some of the most disturbing facts of these cases. But anyway, they seemed unable to really effectively use this technology, because you'll see over and over and over again in these cases, these people are partially abducted. They'll be grabbed by this beam, they'll be drug up, sometimes, several meters up into the sky, sometimes hovering there and dangling there, and then either dropped or put back down. Or the people will see the fireball coming in the sky. It was with how they described it, ofogo, the fire. They'll see it coming and they'll scatter, and they'll hide underneath of, inside their house, or underneath of an awning, grab onto a fence or tree or tall grasses, and just to keep themselves from being held. And there's these tug of wars that take place between these crafts, these lights, and these poor individuals in Brazil who are just farming and just doing their thing, and suddenly getting grabbed by these odd beams that are, sometimes projecting heat, sometimes cold, sometimes both, which is odd. But the point of them seems to be to pull these people away, take them onto these crafts for whatever reason. Who the hell knows what they're? Oh, I'm sorry. Who the heck knows what the end result, or desire was for these poor folks. But in any case, this is what happened in a lot of these cases, and I touched on earlier a little bit about the consistencies with the Stonehenge incidents from North Bergen, New Jersey in 1975 that we touched on in episode 1 of The Bunker. If you haven't seen that, I urge you to go back and listen to that. It's a great episode. The team headed up there and poked around the area, and we had some odd experiences of our own, which seems to be common with folks that begin investigating high strangeness. So anyway, let's talk now for a few minutes before the break about some consistencies that jumped out at me about some of the characteristics of these craft to the Stonehenge incidents. Now, there is a gentleman by the name of Vicente Filho on the evening of September 30th, 1991. He is, again, at the end of the day, it's dark. He is sitting on his property in his truck, and he's sitting in his truck with the windows down, just enjoying the evening, listening to some music on his tape deck, on his radio. And again, this is early 90s, so you're talking about, those old school, radio / cassette players that you had that like manual eject button, and you just push the tape in, and then you have a little button to push and it pops out, He's sitting there listening to some tunes, and he immediately notices the whole area around his truck just lights up like it's daylight. And again, this is important. His first thought was, oh, there must be a car coming down the road towards me. So these must be headlights. He starts looking around, and he doesn't see any particular headlights. It just looks like the whole area around his truck is just illuminated from above somehow. At this point, his tape deck stops playing and ejects the tape, even though he has not touched it. So he thinks to himself, this is weird. What the heck is going on here? He exits his vehicle. He steps out, and he sees a classic disc-shaped flying saucer. He described it as round and as big as a bus. The craft, again, made no noise that he could ascertain. And once he stepped out into the open, he's hit by a beam of light. Here we go again. Caused him to freeze. He described it as it felt like an electrical shock. He begins feeling himself getting pulled upwards. He's feeling the numbness, the paralyzation, the paralysis, everything. And he says at this point, he remembers thinking to himself, and I quote, "I thought the world was coming to an end." End quote. After about 10 seconds, he's slowly getting lifted up. This light switches off. The pull towards this craft stops. He falls back to the ground, and then he sees a sequence of lights around this disc. And it's like a sequence going around the craft of different colored lights. He saw red, green, yellow, and blue lights rotating around the craft. Now, when I read this, it jumped out at me again. It's very similar to the craft that George Obarski saw at North Hudson Park. Had these same alternating, different colored lights rotating around the craft. So when I read that, I jumped out at me like, wow, yeah, there's a similar case. Could these things be related? It's about the same time period. We're talking about the mid 1970s. You know, this is early 1990s, but these reports go throughout from at least 1970 up until 2008, as I mentioned before. So that was an odd consistency that I noticed. Another case on March 24th, going back a little bit, 1978. Luis Saya was abducted. He went missing. He was gone for 3 days. He was found by some other folks in the town in a swamp, laying there, still paralyzed, and was paralyzed for days after he was found, with several of his teeth missing. His hair was burned off. Again, there's this odd relationship between some sort of heat source and the human body, which is strange. His hair wasn't cut; it was burned, and some of the people commented that you could smell the burnt hair when they found him. He was taken to the hospital again, like I said, paralyzed for 3 days after this. And it's his description of the beings that he saw take him on this craft that we're going to focus on. Luis could not see their faces because he described a glass or something. I pictured from his description some kind of helmet perhaps, or a shield, almost like a welding shield, over their faces. So he couldn't see the face, but these creatures were about 3 feet tall. They wore what he described as aluminum foil-looking suits. And they wore long gloves, boots, and something that looked like knapsacks on their backs. And here we go once again. Here's another consistency with the case of Stonehenge from George Obarski. The beings he described getting out of the craft, with the similar lighting pattern that I just mentioned, landing in North Hudson Park. These beings got out of the craft, described just like Luis describes these beings here, short, with backpacks and gloves. This is how he describes these beings that took him on this craft. And this is, like I said, was 1978. And the Stonehenge Incidents were 1975. So right in the same time frame, you have beings fitting the same exact description, flying a similar craft. And in the next case, we're going to get into what struck me as, beings doing similar things that they did in North Hudson Park. In July 1977, in the village of Jusaral, 90% of the people in this area interviewed had a UFO experience or saw strange lights in the sky. There were also 10 fishermen in this area that were burned by a strange light that was shot down on them while they were fishing. So there again, you have this light and this burning. One report from this area details an object seen coming down to the ground, landing, 2 to 3 small figures exiting the craft, and performing what they look like taking soil samples off the ground. Here again, exactly what happened in North Bergen in 1975. This is 2 years later, and we got the same activity going on in Brazil. The light of this craft was described to be as bright as the sun. And after this craft left, it left physical marks on the ground where that landing gear, feet, or whatever it landed on, actually left depressions in the ground. And again, that's a consistency with the North Hudson Park case, George Obarski, because George Obarski questioned himself about this craft, went back the following day or 2 days later, shortly thereafter, to try and prove to himself, I didn't really see that. I must have been hallucinating. Went back to the spot. Sure enough, he found marks in the ground, holes in the ground. He brought his son back. His son witnessed the holes in the ground where this craft was seen. And in fact, he returned almost a year later to the same spot with investigators. And although the holes were filled in, there were spots where the holes had been where the grass did not grow back. So this left an indelible mark on the landscape that was visible for almost, I think it was 11 months later they went by to that spot. And the evidence of that craft was still there. And here again, in Brazil, 2 years later, we have another craft landing with short beings getting out and taking what looked like soil samples. Perhaps they're putting something in the ground, but it looked like they were scooping in the ground or scooping something out of the ground or putting something in the ground. Again, difficult to tell, but same kind of activity being witnessed here. There's, let's see. I think what we're going to do at this point, we're going to take a break. And then when we return, I'm actually going to talk about a couple of cases that have odd similarities to the case at Skinwalker Ranch. Again, just some consistencies with the reports of what was witnessed. It's just shockingly similar in some ways. So, again, we're going to take a break, and after we come back, we're going to talk about the parallels to Skinwalker Ranch. And we're back. Moving on, I'm going to talk about a couple of instances that look like parallels to some of the things, reports that we've heard from Skinwalker Ranch. So in February 1991, near the town of Acari, Brazil, José Danches is the individual that we're going to be talking about in this case. He described that within a year period, he and his co-workers had saw at least 30 lights. 30 different occasions he saw strange lights in the sky. And on this particular occasion that we're going to talk about right now is that he saw a dim yellow light and then two other red lights that were seen with this yellow light moving in some kind of pattern. He said that originally, when he first saw these lights, they looked like police cars revolving lights, but in the sky, which is odd. But then he says that the lights then stopped rotating. One of the red lights went down to the river and then returned back up into the sky to the red light. And at this point, the yellow light opened and it looked like it opened up a window in the sky. And again, if you're familiar with Skinwalker, you'll see that sounds a lot like the quote-unquote window that some of these scientists saw on several occasions open up in the sky, and they describe being able to see a different sky on the other side. Or at one point, this window opened and a being stepped out of it and ran across the property. And by this gentleman's, by José's description here, it sounds very similar to that window. Again, it's described in Skinwalker. In this case, José did not see anything come out of the window. He didn't see anything strange in it or come out of it or anything like that. Just his description of this window that opened in the sky sounds a lot like what was described at Skinwalker. And these red lights then at this point dance around. The window, quote unquote, closes. And the red lights go back down to the river and back up a couple of times. And then the lights just kind of switch off and they're gone. But again, there's that description. When he said that a window opened and this yellow light expanded and opened up a window, sounds a lot like the report of the same thing happening in Skinwalker. Perhaps more dramatic at Skinwalker, as more things that we're seeing happening around that, but still, it's just what it reminded me of. And January 19th, 1996, near Varginha, a farmer and his wife are woken up from his deep sleep from their cattle, stampeding around and bellowing and making all kinds of noise, obviously in some kind of distress. They run outside thinking that they're being robbed, or there's a wild animal messing with their cattle. But again, right away, there's a similarity with Skinwalker, is that there's cattle, and it's a cattle ranch, right? They run outside to see what's going on, and they see an object that they describe looking like a small bus hovering just a few feet above the ground, silently. The wife say that to her it looked slightly cigar-shaped, but they described it as looking like a small bus. And again, I'm thinking of an area where there's cattle, and there's a similar case, a report from Skinwalker talking about this, what they thought was a Winnebago at first on the property, and they thought, how the heck did this person get on the property with this Winnebago driving around? And then once they went out to confront these people, then the quote-unquote Winnebago lifted off the ground and flew over their heads, cutting off the tops of trees. And so again, could this be similar groups of people? Could this be the same craft even? They described it in a very similar way, just based on their own, context. There might not be very many Winnebagos in remote Brazil, but they have buses driving around, right? So that's how they describe it. But it's just a Winnebago and a bus. You could see that being possibly a description of the same craft, whatever the heck it was. But they see this thing take off and fly away, and so those are just a few of the cases that jumped out at me that reminded me of other cases that I have just been reading about recently. Now I'd like to actually get into some of the more disturbing cases. Now, this is evening of November, 1979. Antonio de Lima and Santo Antonio, at 7 p.m., roughly, they see a light approach him on the property, on his farm. Seeing the light approach, and by this point now, the stories were getting around of what's going on when you see these lights in the sky. So he sees this light. He begins to walk home rapidly, a brisk walk home, because he's worried now. Then again, this light approaches him. He's struck by this light. As this thing's approaching him, he throws himself on the ground and just grabs onto some tall grasses as this beam hits him to prevent himself from being pulled away. He feels himself begin to get lifted up, and now he's holding onto some tall grasses and some plants to stop himself. At this point, and here again, this is what I touched on earlier about this technology being either in an R&D sort of process, or these folks are having trouble using the technology. I'm not sure what it is, but at this point, the beam isn't working. He's holding on for dear life onto these grasses and plants. The beam isn't working. He's feeling himself pulled, but he's holding on, and he's staying rooted to the ground, right? He looks up, he sees, because he's watching this thing, he sees a rope come down from the craft that looks like it has 4 hooks on the end, which, when I heard this, I pictured, like a giant fish hook or something like that. When you ever go fishing, you got those hooks on the bottom of your lure, and it's got all these, it's like one hook, but it's got, 3-4 barbs coming off of it. That's what I pictured in my head, which is what it sounds like he describes here. This rope comes down, and these hooks into his shirt, and this rope, with these hooks now, into his clothing, begins dragging him up towards the craft. He gets close enough to the craft where he can see inside of it. He can see in the craft. He sees 3 beings inside the craft. It's 2 women, 2 females, and a man. He described the women as being ugly, but here's the thing. He saw 3 humans. 3 humans. 2 women, and a man. The man, he said, had a beard. The women had short black hair. They wore some kind of blouses with straps, but without sleeves. And he describes their arms as looking yellow. That's really odd. I'm not sure if that's because of the lighting inside the craft or it's because their skin's yellow. I don't really know. But the thing that disturbed me about this is that they're human. They're actual humans in there trying to abduct him. As he's approaching the craft and he's getting closer and closer, he hears the woman say to the men inside the craft, quote, "Here is a good old man we can take with us to our Earth," end quote. I've read this book a couple times. I've read this quote a couple dozen times, and I tell you, I can't read it without just getting a shiver and a chill. Because think of the implications here. 1, these are humans trying to abduct other humans, or at least they appear human, which is more disturbing, that they actually are humans, or that there's some other being that looks human. I'm not sure which one is more disturbing. But they're trying to grab him and they're going to take him to, quote, our Earth? What exactly does that mean? Is some secret place on Earth? Or some other planet that's similar to Earth? I'm not sure how to take that one. You could bend that a few different ways. But nonetheless disturbing. He described his craft as being cigar-shaped again. And Antonio at this point is terrified. He's crying and he's scared for his life. But he said that he didn't cry for help for fear that he would have been taken away quicker. So at this point, by just sheer providence, his shirt rips and the hooks that are hooked into his clothing rips his clothing, and he falls to the ground. The object at this point then spins around a few times and then flies away. He could see that the craft was brown in color, cigar-shaped, and it was about twice the size of a car. And he said that as it left, you could see a small red light in the back of the craft as it moved away. Again, just let that story sink in a little bit. The implications of that, like I said, can go several different ways, and none of them are pleasing to think about. Again, after effects. Antonio felt numbness in his legs. He felt extreme sickness for about a week. And he actually was so disturbed by this that he stopped working, because he knew that if he worked, he would be, at the end of his shift, would be outside after dark, and he just stopped working. He quickly aged. He began having heart issues. His legs became swollen. His hands shook. And again, prior to this incident, he was strong. He was young. He worked hard every day, long hours in the sun. Was as healthy as an ox. After this incident in 1985, he died. So it clearly looks as though his health went downhill as a result of this incident and this attempted abduction, and he was never the same after that, and he just pretty quickly deteriorated after this. It's unfortunate, it's sad, and again, it begs the question, who are these people, or apparent people, that are doing these things to these poor folks? And the cases, and again, I said, I'm just picking a few out here. There's more than this. There's many more than this. Another case that's leaves a disturbing aftertaste is, again, at dusk in 1976. A girl, 9 years old, Ursula, is walking home from cataclysm class and sees a light up ahead of her in a patch of trees. This is, in her path to get home. And as she approaches, she sees a strange craft sitting on 3 legs. It's landed in a dry creek bed. And there are 7 men outside of the craft, all standing around, all in dark suits, about 6 feet tall. All the men turned and stared at her. And of these 7 men, 6 of them were standing and just kind of staring at her. And there was a 7th man kneeling amongst the other 6, spoke to her in a language that she did not understand, but he was knelt over and he was putting pebbles into a transparent bag. She described the men as looking like, quote, Americans. Again, just let that sink in. She described the men as, again, being in dark suits. They had mid-calf high black boots, but she did not see their eyes or their hair. They made no attempt to catch her, but the craft made a strange sound, as she described, sounding kind of like a helicopter. The craft was round, silver. She could see the door, and there were 2 small round windows, one on each side of the door, that had dark glass in them. She could see 2 red lights on the front of the craft, and once this gentleman began speaking to her, she bolted for home, ran home and grabbed, a couple members of the village, first people she saw, describe what she just saw. They run back to the spot, and where they returned, they didn't see the men or the craft, where they were gone by this point, but they did find deep holes in the creek where the craft was landed. So, again, just think about the implications of seeing what she would describe as Americans. There's another report in here that again, humans were seen. They were described as being humans, but not Brazilians. So, again, to have them described as Americans really bothers me, because I'm an American myself, and there's the speculation has been running wild for decades that the U.S. government has been involved in back engineering technology and has been involved in this, and that UFOs in the sky are actually us and not aliens, and some of them are us and some of them are aliens. I mean, the theories go on, but when you have a 9-year-old that describes these these people looking like Americans in black suits, I mean, what does that remind you of? It's absolutely chilling. The next case I'm going to bring up is really friggin' weird and disturbing and kind of scary. This case takes place on Crab Island. This is April 25th, 1977. Again, same time frame, mid to late 70s. A gentleman by the name of Jose and his brothers Apolinario and Firmino, and a cousin, I'm going to try to get this name right, Aloriano, are going to take a boat trip to Crab Island. Now, to set the stage a little bit, folks in this area would sail to Crab Island because there was a concentration of, I don't know if it's bamboo or if it's some kind of tree that they use to cut down and use for poles to make, for building purposes. And they would make a couple trips a year, and they would go and they would cut down hundreds of these things, load them onto the boat, bring them back, and sell them in the town. And folks would use them to make, lean-tos and structures and sheds and stuff for them. Right, so they sailed to Crab Island to collect these construction poles, and they had quit at about 6 p.m. after getting there and cutting down a bunch of these poles. They sat, they ate dinner, they chatted until about 8 p.m., and at this point they went to sleep. And the plan was and at this point now there's low tide, so the boat's sitting in the mud, and they planned on going to sleep around 8 p.m., and just allow the tide to wake them up. Now, once the tide comes in, you can picture these waves coming in and slapping the boat and picking it up, and now it's sitting stationary. Once the water picks it up, now it's moving. So it's a good alarm clock. And they had done this trip 100 times before this, and so they were experienced. There was only one individual that was an amateur on this trip. The rest of them had done this many, many, many times over. So they were pros at it. So they go to sleep with plans to be waken up by the tide, and then they were going to sail the poles back in and be back by the next morning. Now here's where it gets weird. Somehow, no one on the boat woke up until 5 a.m. the next morning. The first thing that happens, Apolinario hears Aloriano calling for help from the front of the boat. Now, Apolinario heard his cries, but he was confused because Aloriano went to sleep in a hammock 4 feet behind him. He wakes up dazed and confused at 5 a.m. hearing these calls for this gentleman that's on the other side of the boat from where he went to sleep. He was kind of confused. He was trying to figure out for a minute where the voice was coming from. So Apolinario found him lying in the bilge and in a few inches of water, screaming apparently in pain, but had no idea what happened or how he got there. So he helps Aloriano onto the deck and drags him up there discovers that he has been burned on both shoulder blades, and on his left butt cheek he's burned. But here's the weird thing. His shorts aren't burned. Only the skin under the shorts is burned. So that stood out as being very odd. So Apollinato fixes him some breakfast, makes him some tea, rather, when he then hears moaning in the cabin. And then he finds Firmino lying under Aloriano's hammock in the back of the boat, even though he had gone to sleep in the front of the boat. So again, no idea how he got there. Firmino was burned on most of his body, to the point his skin was actually coming off. Apollinato tried to open up his eyes, but he could not. His skin was just too burned. He then turns to José's hammock to wake him up to get help. And at this point, he discovers that José is dead in his bunk. His body is cold. He has no pulse. He's already beginning to stiffen from rigor mortis. He looks around on the body really quickly to discern how this could have happened. There was no burns on his body. There was no scratches. There was no bruises. There was not a single mark on his body whatsoever, but he was dead. So at this point, terribly upset, Apollinato has to, he has to keep his head at this point. He realizes he's the only healthy person on the boat, and it's up to him to get everyone back to the town. But the problem is, like I said, they all somehow overslept through the tide coming in. It's now by this point, after 5 a.m., the tide is now back out. He then now has to wait another 8 hours for the tide to come in so that he can begin sailing back to town. So he, just tends to them and just waits. 8 hours goes by, tide comes back in. He then gets the boat back to the docks, but now the town is pretty distant from where the docks are, so he has to get back to the town and hike a couple of miles to get to a police station to report this and get these folks help. Firmino was in a coma for about a week and was in the hospital for a total of a month before he was released. He had second-degree burns over most of his body. His arm muscles were so badly burned that the actual muscles were damaged, and so the fingers in his left hand were permanently curled, and so were mostly useless. The cause of death of José was listed as a cerebral vascular accident caused by arterial hypertension as a consequence of emotional shock. But again, the doctors, nurses, no one could find a mark on him. There was no sign of trauma. The police came back. They inspected the boat. They inspected the area of Crab Island. They could not determine what happened at all. They found no evidence of drugs, of alcohol, any kind of struggle, or violence whatsoever. They found no toxic poisoning from fumes, no food poisoning. There was no sign of fire on the boat or on the island. One means to try to get to the bottom of it, one technique that was used was putting the gentleman under hypnosis. But even under hypnosis, not one of the men could recall any details of that evening once they fell asleep on that boat. Not one detail. There were several witnesses in the area of Crab Island that did see strange lights in the sky. Could it be connected to this? Could be. Maybe not. We don't have a witness to directly tie these lights to this event. But nevertheless, this is a really, really strange thing that happened on this boat. Mr. Pratt, again the author of this book, UFO Danger Zone, did interview these men on 3 separate occasions, years apart. And not one of them was ever able to recall a single detail of what happened to any of them after they fell asleep on the boat. Complete amnesia. This event, like I mentioned earlier, took place in 1977. He went back in 1981. Mr. Pratt did, and interviewed them. He went back again and interviewed them in 1992. Still nothing could they recall. A comment that some of the doctors and some of the investigators made was that burns are some of the most painful wounds that you can receive. And then it's really, really strange that none of the men could remember being burned or remember how they were burned. Couldn't remember anything before the event and couldn't remember anything after the event. Now, you would think if you were under hypnosis or in a trance or even asleep, and you began to get second-degree burns over most of your body, or even just burned on your shoulders and butt, it would wake you up. How could you get burned over most of your body and not wake up? That's one of the facts of this case that just jumps out the page at me and blows my mind. And some of the physicians and the investigators comment on that as well. It is really, really unusual that these men were burned, one of them dead, with no sign of trauma. And there's no evidence of anything. Mr. Pratt actually contacted a couple investigators and went back and he investigated that boat himself. There were some scientific folks down there that were feeling that it was a result of lightning. Lightning struck the boat. They checked the weather reports. There were no storms in the area. No sign of lightning strikes. No witnesses reported any lightning in the area. They checked the weather records. There were no storms in the area, period. They checked, he checked the boat, and there was not one single tiny hint of any sort of burn on the boat. But yet these people were burned while on the boat. They went to sleep in the cabin, not even on the outside of the boat. They put a covering over the hatch to prevent the mosquitoes from coming in, and they were sealed in there. And they somehow slept through the tide coming in and picking up and shaking that boat around. Somehow slept through all that. Somehow slept through getting second-degree burns. And woke up in different parts of the boat from where they went to sleep and have no memory, years later even, of a single detail of what happened. That is disturbing, scary, and super weird. And this might be one of the more stark cases in here, but there are cases of this high strangeness and these abductions and attempted abductions and sightings happened all over this area, up and down the country, for decades. And, I want to comment that this podcast is in no way a replacement for reading this book. Get the book. Read it. Read through all the details. I'm sure I'm just touching on some stuff. I know there's some details I'm missing out on. But nevertheless, these cases jumped out at me as being really disturbing, and I wanted to bring them to you guys and get your take on them. And any additional information you folks have, or any different stories you've heard, or maybe something recent even from this area, I would love to hear about it, because these cases are sort of left of center here from a lot of cases that people have of seeing lights in the sky, or even abduction cases are sometimes described as being pleasant or enlightening, or this knowledge is imparted to these folks or whatever. But I don't know, man. If you ask the people of Brazil, they're going to be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" They got to a point they would see a light in the sky and they would scatter, because o fogo, the fire, would be seen, and they would know it was coming for somebody. It was also referred as chupa chupa, or basically a bloodsucker, because the people that would have close encounters with these things would be sickly. Women would miscarry. The cases, it just goes on and on and on. I mean, when people would come into close contact with these things or get hit with these beams, they would become sick. Sometimes they'd be found dead for no apparent reason. It's not just these guys. There was more. You may have heard about the incidents in Colorado. Same thing. These villagers terrorized by these craft flying over and hitting them with beams and burning them and dragging them away. It's just crazy. But I'm going to stop rambling. We're going to take another break, and then we're going to close out the show. We're going to be talking about the conclusions and implications of these cases and what that could mean for the UFO field, for this study, and for the people that are unfortunately negatively touched by these crafts and these beings. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. So there you have it. There's our little dive into the world of the incidents taking place in Brazil during the 1970s, 80s. As far as we can tell by my research, the latest event taking place in 2008. I just wanted to give a little postscript here. It's just some thoughts on what we discussed during this episode. I have no doubt that these people in Brazil have been terrorized by something in their sky. Hundreds of credible reports have been filed, and these are only the cases that have been reported. And now most investigators that work in this area agree on this, that many more cases are going unreported, and it's mainly due to two causes. Number one, the massive size of the country of Brazil and the remote nature of some of these villages, some of them very, very difficult to even get to. And number two, this very small number of UFO investigators in this area. I mean, I hope nowadays that number has increased, but as of the days that Bob Pratt was there, the 70s through the 90s, the number of investigators looking into these cases back then was very, very small, and not nearly enough to actually document all these cases they believe were happening there. So, again, I hope that nowadays that number has increased and there are more investigators looking into this. Again, if any of my listeners have any information, any current information on the situation going on down there, I'd really appreciate you reaching out. Again, you can reach out to me on Twitter, in the Bunker Cast, or you can send me an email at mailtothebunker@gmail.com. So another thing to me that's certain about these cases is they're not typical of what most people think of when you think of a UFO sighting or mention even an abduction. These cases are pretty unique. In some cases, violent even. Orbs were seen, crafts, beings, but people as well. People described as, quote, human but not Brazilian, unquote, and as, quote, Americans, end quote. Think about that. The implications of these reports, it just, to me, cannot be understated. Is there some kind of group, organization, splinter government down there chasing, capturing, and even in some cases killing the citizens of Brazil? If so, why? To what end? What's the game being played here? Excuse me. I mean, and another fact too that I touched on earlier is that, you know, if this is a group of humans, which it seems to be in some cases, committing these acts on these people in Brazil, are they testing some new technology? It sounded like the technology they were using was not perfected, or they weren't familiar enough with it to use it properly, and so they were turning to these in some cases crude examples of using hooks and nets, while some of these people were grabbing onto trees or fences or whatever for dear life to keep from being taken. There's reports that they were getting sprayed with hot oil, seemingly in an attempt to get them to let go, so that they could be taken by these beings, crafts, whatever the hell they are, whoever they are. But again, some people saw these individuals in these crafts up close, and they saw people. Not gray aliens, not giant insects, not praying mantises. They saw people. And in many cases, white people, to be blunt. So what can that mean? You know, the technology is there because hundreds of reports will speak to the truth of that, but where did this technology come from? Is it some splinter group of the American government down there doing this? I mean, I don't know. If you think about this technology and how it has come into our hands, I mean, there's one of two ways that it could have happened. One, it's either recovered technology from some other civilization and back engineered, or it was homegrown and we designed it. But either way, I just can't get away from the impression that this technology was not quite perfected in the 1970s and 1980s, and it was being tested on these folks down in Brazil, because there are case after case after case of these poor folks getting hit by these beams, getting pulled up, attempted to be pulled up, but then dropped, and then tried, and attempted to pick up again, and then now here comes hooks or nets, just a whole plethora of technology from like the crudest. I mean, when were nets invented and hooks? Hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And in some cases, they're resorting to nets and hooks to get these people, and not this 0-point energy or whatever this technology is that is pulling these folks up into these crafts. I mentioned the military a minute ago. The Brazilian military back in these days, 70s and 80s, were contacted about these cases, and they were asked to investigate. They were asked for help. And it's my understanding that the Brazilian military began looking into this, and then just like in America, same thing happened. At a certain point, they just hit a wall. A switch was flipped. They stopped talking about it, stopped commenting on it, stopped responding to calls and messages, and apparently stopped looking into it, and had nothing to say about it again. But I did actually run across an article on bbcnews.com where it was stated that the members of the Brazilian military, as of 2010, were advised to report any sightings of UFOs to their superiors. And that's 2010. So clearly they're aware of it. Clearly they're keeping an eye on it, and they're monitoring it, to some degree. But it's their lack of transparency with the public that, again, it's what bothers us here, and not just here, but in the UK, in Australia, everywhere. This is going on. We're being kept in the dark because we know our governments are looking into it and monitoring this stuff, but they're not saying a damn thing to us. And the question is why. And yeah, like I said, I keep coming back to the thought that this technology is being tested on these poor people. I mean, when you read the case files, it really sounds like that's what was going on. That this was some kind of R&D program for this technology that was being used there. And if it's being used there, it's not too far of a stretch to think that, like, well, if they saw people inside, and Brazil is where they're testing this stuff, well, there's a superpower that isn't that far away from them. And, some of these folks were described as looking, quote, American. So, we don't have the proof, unfortunately, like in a lot of this stuff, but, again, I can't stress enough the need for everyone that is interested in this phenomena to go out and read this book. It is called, again, UFO Danger Zone by Bob Pratt. His last name is spelled P-R-A-T-T. Get this book. There is so many other reports. Like I said, I just touched on a few of them that jumped out at me. And when you read through the entire book, you really get a better sense of the numbers of reports, the consistent content of these reports and sightings and so forth. And this deeply affected the people of this area. There are many of these folks down there, even some whole entire villages, after these ofogo or the fire came through their villages, refused to go out at night after dark because they were just terrified of being taken by the fire, ofogo, or the chupa chupa. I mean, it's terrifying stuff. And, I urge you, too, to read through this entire book, because when you read through the whole thing, you'll see, too, that case after case of normally healthy people, healthy young people, had a close encounter with these crafts or were hit by a beam, and then suddenly, shortly thereafter, they become sick, they become lame, in poor health all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in a completely unexplained way. There's multiple cases of healthy pregnant women coming into contact with these crafts or with the beams of light who immediately afterwards miscarry. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and I just urge you that if you're interested in this topic to grab this book and just give it a read through. It's quite disturbing stuff. But there's one thing for sure, is that this technology is being used in the remote areas of Brazil on the citizens of that country without their consent, without their knowledge, and to their detriment. These These terrifying cases aren't isolated to Brazil either, but they did seem focused in this area during the 70s and up into the 90s at least. Are they still happening? I'd like to know. If anyone has any current knowledge of this, please reach out, like I said. But also don't stop with this podcast. Do your own research. Ask your own questions, especially if you live in this particular area of the world. Pay attention to details. If you start looking into this thing, get yourself a notebook or notebooks and log everything. Log everything you do, when things take place, how often they take place. Look for patterns. Take your interest to the next level and just look into it. Ask questions and don't be afraid to make waves. There's one other thing I wanted to just mention before I wrap this up here, and that is a case that Mr. John Keel worked on. Some of you may be familiar with the Mothman prophecies. I was just, like many of you, enjoying watching Hellier Season 1 and 2, in which those folks, which is a fantastic program, by the way, but they mention in there a lot of consistencies with their case and the case of the Mothman and John Keel. And so that book was on my mind, so I went back and I ordered it, gave it another read through. And this is, keep in mind, this is while I'm looking into researching, going through and taking notes and writing the outline for this episode having to do with Brazil, right? Now, while this is going on, I'm reading through the Mothman in my free time, and I approach page number 133, where Mr. John Keel is speaking to a Woodrow Derenberger, who is a witnesser and was an abductee in the area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, during all these Mothman incidences. And on page 133, he says something very, very interesting. Now, this takes place after the story kind of hit the news, and that area was flooded by UFO enthusiasts and reporters and TV stations, and there was a lot of hubbub around that area once these stories got out and into the media. And now this story takes place apparently after that hubbub and the attention and all of the activity around that area seemed to die down a little bit. And right here on page 133, I'll just read you this paragraph. Mr. Keel writes, by March 1967, the crowds had given up in discouragement, and Mr. Cold, that's Indrid Cold, was able to safely land his spaceship on Woody's farm. Woody went aboard, according to his story, and took a flight all the way to Brazil and back. And he goes on to describe the interior of the craft and what it looks like and how it was shockingly mundane, and he is then brought to a planet called Lanalos, which is featured in not only his reports, but some other witnesser reports and abductee reports as well. But so that's kind of a strange little synchronicity right there, where I'm looking into something in Brazil and I pick up another book that I don't feel is related at all, and then lo and behold, one of the main characters in that book is taken aboard a craft and flown to Brazil. So I did actually go into the records, and I tried to see if there were any actual UFO sighting reports during that time, but I wasn't able to track any down. But doesn't mean they weren't there, and it's just kind of interesting how I'm just thinking about the consistencies between these cases and the cases that that we have featured in some of our episodes, and the mention of synchronicity and the phenomena and its effects on us, and how it sort of seems to involve us. And then that little passage pops up right in my face, and I literally gasped. I was reading that. So just goes to show you, this is in some ways and on some level is all connected. So like I said, if you're interested in this topic, read as much as you can. Get trained if you are so inclined. Get out to the field and investigate. Take notes. Look for patterns. And try to get to the bottom of it. The more of us out there looking to figure this out, the greater chance we have of figuring this out. So just want to thank everyone again for joining us. You may notice that we are free of sort of random theme music for our episodes right now. We're beginning to get a little big for our britches, and I don't want to get sued. So I'm actually working on getting my own theme music. I may actually write something and perform it myself. I'm not quite sure where we're going yet, but look forward to that. Again, give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. We're also on Spotify. Give us a rating on there. Share us on social media, on Twitter. Again, if I mentioned my email a couple times, I won't say it again here, but if you're having any of these strange events taking place in your life, drop me an email, and we can have you come on and share your story. I can help you completely confidentially, or any mixture of the two. Completely up to you, but really interested to hear if anybody has any updates to the activity going on in this area. So again, thank you in advance. I appreciate that. So that about wraps it up. Yeah, I wish everyone a great rest of your day and a great weekend. And just keep reading, keep inquiring, keep searching. The truth is out there.